Captain Zara Thorne flies right into the Arcturus Hive ship, intent on rescuing her Imperial executionee brother David, and ends up starting the biggest prison break in history, letting loose tens of thousands of political prisoners. But as its ragtag crew attempts to win back the freedom that was stolen from them, they'll face Such begins the adventure of the Prometheus Requiem, a captured prison transport from the very edges of explored space. General Destruction and his Invincibles form the nucleus of the rebellion against the brutal and unjust rule of the hegemonist order. Captain Zara Thorne had 43 seconds left to live when her fighter's engines died. The warnings blinked across her cockpit display as her ship spun out of control, falling toward the gargantuan bulk of the Arcturus Hive ship, a hulking prison that had plagued the outer systems for 3 years. Billing the bastard had taken months as she hunted it down from one part of space to the next, much like a predator tracking a lame animal. Now, with her fighter shredding apart around her, she knew the hunt was about to get a whole lot bloodier. The last thing she remembered was the darkness hitting her mind, but death had other ideas. Zara came to with the sound of her own breathing reverberating in her helmet, trapped under a mass of bent metal inside what used to be the cockpit of the F-77 Raptor authorities had until recently claimed as lost. There was a tang of ozone and melting polymer in the air, and through her cracked helmet, she could see a dim red emergency lighting stretching into corridors no sane construction. Bluey, Ed should be a space chapter here. Eller was behind her now. She was inside the Hive ship. Zara willed herself to see beyond the throbbing that blazed from her left leg. The collision had ripped through the outer plating and several bulkheads, leaving a wound in the ship's side that her fighter now filled like a splinter. Low ambient pressure, borderline life sustainment Type 3 biofilled the heads-up display of her survival suit. It was running off the ship's artificial gravity, so the main reactor was still operational. Most crucially, her emergency beacon was silent, so no one was coming to rescue her. She was all alone on a vessel with over 10,000 prisoners from all over the galaxy. The Arcturus Hive ship was a relic of the corporate wars, a huge carrier of the kind which first took colonists to far-off stars. The hegemony had turned it into something much worse by the time they came to power, a prison that could be used to carry entire populations of dissidents, rebels, free thinkers, anyone inconvenient. The ship roamed throughout the periphery systems, its course known to none but the command of the hegemony, gathering prisoners and vanishing them permanently. It was this that Zara had been stalking because her brother David had been somewhere within its walls. She dragged herself from the debris with the precision of one who had lived 3 tours in the rebellion. Her left leg had broken, but the suit's medical mechanisms had already slapped on emergency splints and pain suppressors. She grabbed what she could from the fighter, her sidearm, emergency rations, and medical supplies, and most of all, her brother's dog tags, which she had kept in her possession for 3 years. The corridor from where she'd hit went dark then, lined with the institutional gray polymer of all hegemony design. The air recycling system purred along mechanically, and in the distance she could hear the low mumble of the ship's great engines. But something else that made her skin crawl. Voices. Hundreds of voices. Perhaps thousands, which sounded as though they were coming from far deeper inside the ship. Zara started walking. Her broken leg shot pain signals through her body with each step. The corridor forked and divided, a labyrinth of passageways that appeared designed to deorient and confuse. She continued the sound of the voices, relying on her military orientation to move on memory and instinct. The noise grew louder as she worked her way down the corridor, the voices gradually resolving themselves into separate conversations, disputes, and what sounded like coordinated chanting. The first cell block she found turned her stomach. CL rows of crystallized aluminum cages from floor to ceiling, and each one held a single prisoner. The passengers were human, but just barely. Their heads were shaved, their bodies swathed in matching gray jumpsuits, and their eyes were those familiar 1,000-mile scares of human beings who had been shattered by sustained cruelty. They stared at her with a combination of wariness and desperate hope. "You're raw," came a voice from the closest cage. The speaker was a woman, maybe in her 40s, of the wiry body type that comes from decades of hard labor. "They don't usually house new arrivals in the upper blocks." Zara came forward to peer in at the cage, inspecting the lock. It was electronic, managed by some big central processing unit that she would need access codes to in order to operate. "I'm not a prisoner. I'm here to get people out." The woman chuckled, a humorless sound. "No one gets out of the Arcturus. People go in, but they don't come out. The only way off this ship is through the recycling chutes." "What's your name?" Prisoner 7743. Around here, they don't let us keep our names. Anger welled in Zara's chest, that familiar heat that had carried her through 3 years chasing down the ship. What was your name before? The woman hesitated, as if she were afraid to recall. Maya Castellanos. I used to be a teacher on New Bethlehem before the hegemony decided education was sedition. Well now, Maya Castellanos, my name is Captain Zara Thorne, and I am going to get you out of here. All of you. Maya's eyes widened. Thorne? Are you in some way related to David Thorne? Zara's heart stopped. You know my brother? He was here, cell block 7, level 15. He formed the ship's first resistance cell. The guards discovered it and had him moved to the deep blocks. No one ever returns from the deep blocks. The deep blocks. Zara stored that away, along with knowing that David was leading a resistance of some kind even here, even in this nightmare. She studied the cell lock and then pulled her sidearm. Stand back. The plasma bolt burst the electronic lock, and the door of the cage opened. The door opened, and Maya emerged, shaky legs showing vestiges of what had clearly been months of incarceration. Nearby, thousands of other prisoners erupted, screaming oaths and pounding on the walls of their cages, demanding that they be released too. We can't liberate them all, Zara interpreted Maya's expression. Not without the primary safety codes. The instant you unlock several cages or more, and you'll flood the whole block with sedative gas automatically. Zara put away her gun and tried to handle things practically. She had trained in special operations, had led commando raids behind enemy lines, but never in circumstances like this. The Hive ship was a prison, as a fortress, heavily fortified and built to keep its detainees in through multiple lines of security. Yet every fortress had its weak places, and every system had its Achilles heels.
You must describe the ship's layout to me, she said. Security stations, sentry points, command centers. Maya's expression grew thoughtful. The vessel is a 20-level ship. The higher 5 levels are command and crew quarters. The 10 middle levels are cell blocks like this one. Those 5 levels at the bottom are the deep blocks, where they house the subjects of their experiments. Experimenting? The hegemony doesn't simply wish to jail the dissenters. They want to shatter them, reprogram them, fashion them into obedient citizens. The deep blocks are where they hone their skills. Maya's voice grew bitter. Your brother got sent there because they didn't think he was safe in general population. He made people feel they could fight back. Zara felt the pressure of her brother's dog tags on her chest. David had always been the dreamer, the one who believed in justice and freedom when the odds were impossible. If he was in the deep blocks, he was dead, or worse than dead. How many guards? 200 for the whole ship, maybe? The hegemony uses automation and terror to rule. The core of them are up above on the higher tiers, with small teams that occasionally patrol the cell blocks in shifts. Zara was starting to hatch an idea. It was crazy. It was suicidal. It was out of the question, which meant that it was precisely the kind of plan that might work. Maya, I must get the word to the Kanjeeps prisoners. Tell them to hold outside for a prison break in 6 hours. Tell them to be ready. 6 hours? We kind of have no time to rally anything together. It's not about coordination. It's about creating chaos. Fear and routine, the hegemony rules this ship. If we can break those 2 things at the same time, we can open this thing up. Maya nodded slowly, starting to get it. You're coming up on the security center. I'm going to hit everything. Security, communications, life support, navigation. If you liked that, wait till I get through with this ship. I'm going to wreck the place. That's when we do our thing. Zara left Maya to go and start whispering along, and she went further down into the ship. The light began to dim as she went down the lower corridors, and the convicts' voices were no longer audible. They merged into a gloomy silence. She was passing into the higher officer levels now. The crew lived and worked. The decor went from institutional gray to something more homey, including carpeted floors and actual artwork on the walls. The first guard she saw was a boy, maybe 25 years old, with the sort of untested face that suggests he had never seen a day of actual fighting. He had been on a routine patrol when he got lost in his handheld device, oblivious to his surroundings. Zara choked him out with a sleeper hold and relieved him of his weapon and access cards, then moved on. The ship's security center was on level 3, beyond a few checkpoints of electronic locks and biometric scans. Zara swiped the guard's ID card against the outer doors and used whatever Mama-san had caught her in military school to circumvent the more high-tech gadgets beyond. The center itself was a circular room surrounded by hundreds of monitors depicting every cell block, corridor, and hangout spot on the ship. 2 guards sat on duty in front of monitors. They didn't see Zara until she was behind them, her pistol pressed into the back of the first guard's skull. "No one is moving, no one is dying," she said in a calm, professional voice. The guards obeyed with hands raised. Zara snapped the chains with their chains-backed restraint and hit the machines. The security web was more intricate than Evie had anticipated, with layers upon layers of encoded security and backup protocols. However, the hegemony made one serious miscalculation. They built a corner of the AngelNet to be run by people who really didn't need to be that smart or ambitious.
The codes were on a piece of paper under the center console, taped there. Zara clicked into her work, her fingers a blur over the controls. First, she sabotaged the automatic sedation systems in all the cell blocks. Then she started releasing them systematically, beginning with the leaders and organizers that Maya supplied. On the monitors, prisoners emerged in droves from cells, their faces a blend of jubilation and incredulity. Next came the communication systems. Zara had implanted a virus that would send the enemy ship's ability to communicate with Hegemony Command crashing to Earth, buying them some time while reinforcements rallied to reach them. Afterward followed the navigation systems, and then came the automated defenses that shielded the ship from the outside. But it would be the life support systems that really spawned the chaos. Rather than close them off, Zara started diverting them, allowing non-toxic but nauseating gas to vent through the upper levels while at the same time raising the air pressure below. The guards, meanwhile, would be bewildered and ill, and the prisoners all jazzed up to fight some more. There was only one dangerous part to take. Zara broke into the ship's primary computer system and began downloading everything. Information on the prisoners, guard rotations, command codes, and most importantly, the whereabouts of the deep blocks. The data streamed into her suit's onboard memory banks, terabytes of data that would reveal the full extent of the hegemony's war crimes. Suddenly, alarms rang across the ship as the security measures were sensing the intrusions. Zara had perhaps 10 minutes until the guards got it together to mount a real resistance. She was about to pack up and head out when something on one of the screens captured her eye. 20 revealed a corridor stocked with medical gear and operating tables. And bound to one of those tables, unconscious but alive, was her brother David. Zara had found him. 3 years she had searched and hunted the Hive ship throughout the galaxy, and there he was. He seemed thinner than she remembered, his face etched with the kind of surgical scars that suggested repeated procedures, but he was alive. The deep blocks were 15 levels beneath her now, along corridors that would be swarming with guards in a matter of minutes. Conroy knew the smart play would be to take part in the general prison break, to help organize the uprising and pray like hell that David was saved in the chaos. But smart plays were a genre Zara, to this day, had no interest in. She was seeking her brother. The trip down through the ship was a running fight. Guards had caught on and were trying to calm things down. Zara cut her way through as though she was taught to kill without remorse and a sense of purpose. Her leg was broken and it slowed her down, but the suit's medical systems, antibiotics and painkillers injected at autopump intervals, kept her going. The prisoners she had released were pulling their weight, causing havoc around the ship.
They were armed with makeshift weapons such as furniture and equipment, and used their familiarity with the ship's layout to outsmart the guards. Every monitor Sorrel passed displayed scenes of insurrection, prisoners swarming guard posts, smashing security cameras and freeing their fellow captives. But Level 15 broke her heart, but Level 15 was like a hat on a hat. The deep blocks were a medical center that included not only operating rooms, but also laboratories and the kind of holding cells that resembled hospital rooms more than prison cells. The inmates who dwelled in this place were unlike those on the above floors. They operated as mechanically as if they had been programmed, with eyes bereft of personal thought or feeling.
Zara located documents of the processes: neural reprogramming, memory alteration, personality reconstruction. The hegemony weren't just jailing the pro-democracy protesters, they were using them as experiments, to send them home to their worlds having been altered to believe that the hegemony was good news. It was a psychological battle that pitted the rebellion's own people against them. Hundreds of prisoners in different stages of the process were crammed in the holding cells. Some were still themselves, freshly caught and awaiting their first operation. Others had been turned totally. Oberon knew, had their personalities scrubbed away and replaced with hegemony programming. And there were some that were somewhere in between. Their minds were trapped in a half-light, a half-world that was not what they had been, nor what they were having to become. Zara began unlocking them, the ones that appeared to be the most sentient first. Most of them were too far gone to be helped, but some kept enough of themselves to realize what was happening to them. They became part of her little army, their faces showing the same blend of resolution and desperation she felt. David was in the heart of the building, strapped to a surgical table and surrounded by neural programming machinery. He was out cold, his head shaven and that type of surgical prep on his scalp that suggested he was down for some major surgery. But his eyes were there, and when Zara said his name, they opened with the kind of recognition that spoke of his personality remaining in one piece. "Zara?" His voice was faint, but it was him for sure. "How did you find me?" "I never stopped looking." She started to disconnect the medical devices, her hands trembling between the rush of adrenaline and relief. "We're getting out of here, all of us." David attempted to sit up, but his body was floppy from whatever drugs they'd shot him up with. "The others, there are others like me, people they're about to reprogram. We can't leave them behind." "We're not leaving anyone behind." Zara pulled her brother to his feet and half carried him as they returned through the building. The prisoners that they had released were rallying, utilizing their understanding of the ship's systems to communicate with the rebellion on the higher floors. They were armed now, with weapons confiscated from the guards they had crushed, and they were wielding these with a desperate sort of efficiency that can only come from having nothing left to lose. Retreat through the upper levels was a fighting withdrawal. The guards had regathered, trying to suppress the mutiny, but they were heavily outnumbered and battling an enemy that knew the ship better than they did. Zara drove her little army through maintenance corridors and service shafts, everywhere bypassing dirty business as much as possible, while being up to her eyeballs in it. They arrived at the cell blocks to discover a full-fledged revolt underway. Thousands of prisoners had been released and were methodically commandeering the ship piece by piece. The guards were withdrawing to stronger positions, but they had no place to withdraw to. Maya was waiting for them at the entrance to Cell Block 7, her expression caught somewhere between hope and disbelief, the way Zara's felt. "The top floors are ours. The bridge is being guarded. They only—" "What about communications?" "Still down. Your virus is working perfectly. They can't call for help." Zara nodded and addressed the circle of ex-prisoners that surrounded them. They were a motley crew, from worlds no two alike, but who all wore the same expression of people who'd been broken once too often and looked out at what they'd found worth standing up to. "Hear me out," she added, her voice floating across the hallway. "We've taken this ship, but that's the easy part. There are other ships like this one, other centers where the hegemony is keeping our people. We can't just run away. We need to ensure that this never occurs again." The crowd muttered its assent, And looking around, Zara could see the sparks of rebellion in their eyes. These were not just prisoners anymore. They were revolutionaries. Fighters in a war that had lasted years.
The ship's systems detail everything. Rosters of prisoners, locations of facilities, command orders. We shall beam that information to every rebel cell in the galaxy. We will uncover the crimes of the hegemony and pass this information to the rebels for them to strike back. Maya stepped forward. What about the guards? Some of them are merely doing their job. Those who surrender will be treated as prisoners of war. Those who fight will be regarded as enemies. Zara's voice was gravelly, tinged with the anger she felt at what had been done in the opening moments of the war, to her brother and to thousands of others. But first, we have to make the ship completely secure. David himself made the final assault on the bridge even while he was injured. He strode through the ship as if he had spent months thinking about this moment and showed whomever they came across where defenses were poorest and the guards weakest. The prisoners, who rarely saw the Germans but heard news from the British by code and read news in smuggled newspapers, followed him with the sort of devotion that told of good leadership, shared suffering. The bridge guards gave up without firing a shot, their commanders knowing when to cut their losses. The captain of the ship, a middle-aged woman with that sort of cold efficiency that seemed a hallmark of the career hegemony officers, was last to release her weapon. "You're fucking up," she told Zara when he placed her under arrest. "The hegemony will not allow this to stand. They're going to come after you and make you examples." "Let them try," Zara replied, "and we have captured their ship, their logs, and their men. Most important, we have something they cannot fathom, people who are prepared to fight back for what is good." A whirlwind followed in the next few hours. The convicts formed into work gangs, working the ship and readying themselves for the ordeal ahead. The injured received treatment, the dead were honored, and the freed workers of the deep blocks were medically treated. Zara was in the captain's office, studying the logs of the ship and learning the extent of the hegemony's prison network. The Arcturus was one of a dozen ships, all of them packed with thousands of prisoners culled from every part of the galaxy. The whereabouts of the rest of the ships was encrypted, but there were data in the computer systems to start following them. David followed, his suasion returning as the drugs filtered out of his system. "I've been brooding about what you said," he said, pulling up a chair in front of her. "Speaking of getting the information to the rebel cells. It's the right thing to do. People have to understand what's happening." "I agree, but I believe that we can do more than just deliver information. We can make this ship a weapon." Zara glanced up from the computer screen, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "The Arcturus is a huge, well-armed and heavily armored ship. More than that, though, it's a symbol. The Hive ships. Everyone in the galaxy who is a dissident knows about the Hive ships, knows that people go in and nobody comes out. If we can flip that symbol, if we can make it a symbol of hope instead of fear, well, we can change the whole theme of this rebellion."
David was correct, and Zara was now getting excited about what it all meant. The Arcturus could be transformed into a mobile base for rebels throughout the galaxy. They could use it to liberate prisoners from the other Hive ships, to hit hegemony installations, to bring the fight directly to the enemy. "We'd need a crew," she said, musing. "Guys who know how to manage a ship this size." "We have 10,000 people who have nothing to lose and everything to gain. Some of them are engineers, pilots, weapons experts. Others are teachers, doctors, scientists. Among all of us, we can figure it out how to make this work." Zara agreed, sensing signs of a grander plan beginning to manifest. So the Arcturus would be more than a prison ship. It would be a symbol of resistance, a demonstration that the hegemony was not invincible, that it could be beaten. The transformation didn't happen overnight.
Converting the prison ship into the floating base of operations was a weeks-long project of hard labor and elaborate planning. The cell houses were remodeled into dormitories, training areas, and shops. The existing medical buildings were used to tend to the psychological as well as the physical damage that the prisoners had endured. Maya ended up being a great organizer, coordinating people who had not worked together in years in numbers that were in the thousands. She set up schooling for the children that were born on the ship, medical aid for the prisoners who are recovering from the neural programming, and counseling for everyone who was recovering from the trauma of imprisonment. David was in command of military operations and turned to his experience in organizing resistance cells to train the men who had just been prisoners in combat tactics and weapons handling. He was organized and patient, knowing that while these were not soldiers, they could, with the proper training and motivation, become formidable fighters. Zara had found herself being the overall commander, something she'd never wanted, but she was the perfect one for the job. She had the military background needed to appreciate strategy and tactics, the leadership qualities required to manage large groups of people, and above all, the moral authority that could emerge only from being the woman who made the rescue happen. Their first trial maturity test came when they overrode a hegemony transport, guaranteeing other hostages to another prison. The Arcturus exited hyperspace directly in front of the transport, its immense size making the smaller ship look like an ant by comparison. The ship's crew didn't even resist, and within hours, an additional 300 prisoners were freed. Every time they rescued someone, they grew stronger together, gaining new abilities and a new community. They saved a team of scientists that helped them to comprehend the neural programming technology and to revert some of the damage inflicted upon the deepest block inmates. They freed a convoy of engineers who had aided them in refining the ship's systems and weapons. But it was the saving of a cluster of children that brought home what they were fighting for in the end. The children had been removed from their families by a hegemony program of youth indoctrination. They were scared, they were young, and they'd been taught to be afraid of everything that wasn't certified by the government. Zara saw the former prisoners toil as they tried to explain to the children that they were safe, that they were free, that they could choose their own thoughts and their own way of life. It was slow going, and it took time and understanding, but the children gradually learned to trust their rescuers once more and to remember what it felt like to be free. The leads they cobbled together from each extraction led them to more sites, to the mapping of the circuits of oppression the hegemony used, and to plotting even larger intervention. They discovered secret research facilities where the government was developing new forms of control, training centers where loyal citizens were turned into enforcers of authority, the vast bureaucracy that kept the whole monstrous machine running. But they also learned about the opposition, the thousands of people who were finding small ways to fight back every day. There were underground railroads getting people out, resistance cells that were secretly recording the government's crimes, rebel groups that were preparing their own offensives against hegemony targets.
The Arcturus turned into a nexus for all of these activities, a place where the disparate elements of the resistance movement could align and pool resources. Zara soon located herself at the core of an expanding group of rebels, revolutionaries, and freedom fighters, all focused on taking down the hegemony. The showdown occurred as they tried to save the captives from the biggest Hive ship in the Armada, the Goliath, the biggest in the fleet, which housed more than 50,000 people. The ship was secured with a vengeance, its bulk encircled by an escort fleet and ringed by the best security the hegemony could provide. The fighting had been harsh. The last of the captured ships and bulk of the Volunteers' fleet was arrayed with the Arcturus against the hegemony. There was Zara calling out orders from the bridge, and David leading boarding parties across the enemy ships, of course. The battle raged for hours, and both sides sustained heavy casualties. But ultimately, it was the prisoners themselves who mattered. As Arcturus boarding parties breached the defenses of the Goliath, the inmates mutinied, assaulting guards with makeshift weapons and taking advantage of their familiarity with the ship's structure. Within hours, the revolt had spread across the entire ship,
and another 50,000 individuals were liberated. The win was total, but at a price. Most of the fighters who had stood with Zara and David died during the battle, including Maya, who had been killed while leading a charge against the Goliath Security Center. Her last words were a cause to the people for whom she had helped organize. Tell them we are free. After the battle and the effort to absorb all the newly liberated prisoners into their already burgeoning colony, Zara found herself dwelling on the long road that had led them here. It had begun with only one crash land, a desperate woman searching for her brother. It had grown into something vastly greater, a revolution that had liberated hundreds of thousands of people and revealed the hegemony's crimes to the galaxy. The Arcturus was more than a ship now. It was a symbol of hope, a symbol that the common man could rise up against tyranny and triumph. This had turned them into citizens of a very different sort of society, one of mutual aid and solidarity, not fear and control. David was whole again. After his time on the deep blocks, his memories were all in place, his spirit undamaged. He was now a leader himself, one that some of the people he helped to shape admired, but most of all, he had transformed into the brother Zara had cherished, the hopeful prince who had believed in justice and freedom despite impossible odds. As to Zara herself, she'd gained something she might not have thought possible, a mission that transcended personal vendetta and the call of duty. Now she had been the face of a movement, a stand-in for the promise in a galaxy that had appeared locked into centuries of oppression. The hegemony was still there, still dominating the majority of the galaxy, still enslaving in various ways millions of people. But they weren't invincible anymore, no longer the unchallenged masters of human destiny. The Arcturus and its sister ships traversed the galaxy, freeing prisoners, unveiling crimes, and calling others to arms. And in the end, that was what mattered the most. Not one battle or another, but the idea that resistance was possible, that there was a choice, that the refusal to submit, to bow to oppression made sense as a way of life, and that freedom was always around the corner for those who were willing to fight for it. Zara is on the bridge of Arcturus, staring out at the stars, contemplating the future. There were other battles to fight, other people to rescue, more work to do. But she felt hope for the first time in years. The galaxy was in transition, and she and her brother and all the people that had freed were a part of that transition. The crash landing that had begun it all had been ages ago, but the lesson it had taught had remained. Sometimes the most important journeys start with a catastrophe, and sometimes the greatest triumphs spring from the worst disasters. Zara went to free her brother, and she freed an entire army. Now that army was poised to free the galaxy.